Hello and welcome to another In Conversation with Steve Quartermain. And today I am delighted to welcome as my guest uh, Hugh Ellis, Policy Chair at TCPA, Policy Director. Is that what you call yourself, Hugh?
Uh, that's yes. Other people are less kind, but I call myself policy director. Yes.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, look, I'm really pleased that you've agreed to join me today for a conversation. And I feel the need to sort of mention that we're in it's Patrick's Day today, St. Patrick's Day today, so we're well into lockdown 2020. And if anybody is watching this in archive in years to come, yes, I do need a haircut. But as soon as the hairdressers are open, I will go there. Listen, I want to start by having a bit of a general chat with you about the state of planning, I suppose, and I'm going to begin by asking you a question about what's the purpose of planning? Well, why do you think we have planning at all?
Yeah, it's a really interesting time, isn't it, to reflect on, because the stock of planning is pretty low, and it's also going through this incredible rapid transition. And the way I think I've come to think about it is there are two sort of questions in a way. There's what the sort of statutory planning system is, and then there's what the idea of planning is. And the second thing really still excites me. The idea of planning as being this way of shaping places, of understanding the human experience, of being able to improve people's lives, of being able to tackle the big questions facing society like climate change. All those issues lead you to a place, I think, where you should feel at the end of the day excited and stimulated, and you should feel that the art of planning is, both democratic and it also does have visionary elements. It is very complicated. There's a lot of argument, isn't there? There's a lot of contested ideas, but we're answering the most fundamental question there is, which is how we're going to live in difficult times. So it pains me a great deal to see planning, resorted to just a checklist of basic issues on a permitted developments. That's not what my idea of planning is. But whether, Steve, the question for both of us is whether that notion of planning has a future or whether it can be kind of resurrected. I don't know. It's certainly pretty grim times, isn't it?
Well, we'll probably come on to that in a minute, Hugh, but I do want to dwell on the sort of why we have planning in the first place, and to think about the purpose of it, because I suppose it's a bit like I'm a champion of planning myself, so you're you can say, well, we're probably talking to the converted here, but I recognise that there's always an argument, isn't there, that it's a bit like, I know, if you follow cricket, you can be a cricket supporter and you love it. Not everybody loves cricket, not everybody loves football or follows Strictly Come Dancing. Is it a niche thing that the planners think is their territory? And presumably planning's been going on for years. We didn't invent planning in 1948. So is it a bit at risk of being ideologically driven, and we need to make sure that it maintains a link with the real world?
I think it's got values, hasn't it, planning, and it always had. Its heritage comes out of that, great tradition, I suppose, of Ruskin and Morris and others who posed a simple question: how can you make people's lives better?
Yeah.
You know what? I don't ever regard it as being narrowly ideological, what we do. I think it's actually quite messy, but it is broadly sort of progressive, and it is, I think, also democratic. That's the British tradition of planning, anyway. So, there's all sorts of different kinds of planning. It's been around forever, hasn't it? But I think the particular kind of planning we've distilled has become quite difficult because I think communities mistrust the planning process. I think planners are often, poorly regarded, which is unfair. So we probably need to broaden out this notion of planning. I suppose that's what I'm really saying. It's actually a much broader idea. And so, to give you a really stupid example at my own expense, I remember bitterly regretting saying to a woman with a pushchair outside a school, she came up to me, and obviously I am a planner and I look like a planner, for better or worse. She said to me, well, I'm really worried. And I said, what are you worried about? All these people smoking outside the school gates, that sets a bad example for the kids. And I immediately said to her, oh, well, that's not a planning matter. And you know what? I've bitterly regretted that response ever since. Because truth is, of course, that planning is about how people interact with space, isn't it? And actually I should have had a better bloody answer, to be frank, than that. Yeah. And I think that's where we can get defensive. We can say, oh, well, that's nothing to do with us. Well, everything, to some extent, from the cracks in the pavement to global climate change, isn't that part of our... I'm not saying we're responsible, not you and I, Steve, are responsible for global climate change, but I am saying that to some extent, we've got a contribution to solving those problems and enabling people actually to have better environments, healthier environments. And I suppose the health agenda, isn't it? It's been amazing. I mean, reconnecting with just the power that places have on people's mental and physical well-being. Well, we've relearned that, but of course, planning knew that 150 years ago, didn't it? That's where we come from. So,
I'll argue even before, and I'm going to come back to health in a minute, Hugh, because I want to ask you about your healthy planning act. But you're right. I mean, when I did geography, I was taught about in the Middle East, the planned cities, going back to I don't know something like 4 BC. So planning isn't new, and I often try and articulate the purpose of planning as being about making things work, making life better. You wouldn't plan a kitchen without thinking about where you're going to put things. And I think that for me, I'm a great advocate of planning, but I do recognise that we need to sort of think about how do we retain our relevance to people in current thinking. So if I think about post-war, pre-1948 Act, the philanthropic thinking, the idea that we needed to make this place a better place. It was sort of, was it an easier space for planners to inhabit? Has it become more difficult in the 20th century when arguably, economics have improved, social improved? There's still a lot to do, but are we in a different world now than we were then? Where are the great planners now? Where's the Abercrombies?
Well, that is a really powerful question, and because these conversations are ones of openness, aren't they? That's what really worries me. I mean, with all due respect to us, those figures aren't quite there in the same way, and I don't want those figures to be necessarily pipe smoking kind of patrician people saying this is what's going to happen. But you are right. We don't command the same sort of presence in civil society. Planning is which is a shame, I think, because we've got an important voice in these solutions. But in relation to the sort of post-war history of planning, I mean, the difficulty is that planning made so much progress in this country, did so much to improve people's lives, but of course that gets very easily forgotten. And we also made some big mistakes, didn't we? I mean, and we've got to own up to those. And any human discipline makes mistakes. There's no point in pretending we didn't. And I think probably one of the defining mistakes is that when you drift away from the lived experience of people and what their needs are, then inevitably, that's a dangerous moment. Ebenezer Howard wasn't a professional planner. What would he be now? I don't know, an activist? He'd probably be part of Incredible Edible or Extinction Rebellion. I don't know what he'd be, but you also need. So in fact, actually, Steve, the thing is, there's lots of organisations and communities doing planning, but they just don't call it that, do they? That emphasis, that enthusiasm, that desire to take control of their own spaces and do good things with them on the whole is still out there. We just need to reconnect with it.
Well, talk about reconnect.
I'm afraid.
Well, no, it's a good way of describing it here about trying to reconnect. And I think that I was talking to my wife about planning, and she's not a planner, and she was talking about planning should be more like Kylie Minogue. And she referred to Kylie Minogue because she said that she has survived by reinventing herself, continually sort of representing herself to her audience in a different way. Should planning sort of embrace its inner Kylie and try and be more sort of attractive to the current generation?
Absolutely. I mean, that is the metaphor, and I'm sure that's the challenge in front of us. I accept it willingly. Absolutely, we should. I mean, look, no, any human endeavour that is perceived like planning as, which is just a set of very boring people doing boring things in an office of varying relevance to the world. I mean, but actually, what planning is Hollywood. If I ask you this question, are you interested in your neighbour's extension? Well, you might be. Are you interested in the future of Hull and whether or not it has one in 50 years? Are you interested in decarbonisation? Whether or not societies can be resilient? Are you interested in creating safe spaces for women and girls, given the tragic events of this week? Yeah. If you're interested in any of that, and you're not a planner, but you want to make progress with that agenda, you need to be able to think about the broad building blocks of planning, don't you? I mean, creating safe spaces for people is all about design and planning and consent and democracy and voice and power and all sorts of other things. I just can't understand why people don't wake up every morning excited to be planners. But of course, that's just because I'm a bit weird. But yeah.
Well, I think I do, and I'm sure you you do you as well. And I'm a great fan of planning. I'm a great fan of Kylie actually as well. But there's a secret you probably didn't know. But for me, I do want to try and think about how we get the next generation, the generation before, beyond that, to be enthusiastic about planning. And I do think that at times we can think about it's all not as good as it should be, but actually it is a great profession, and it can do great things. But one of the things I wanted to ask you about it was picking up something you said earlier about, here we are trying to make life better, and we often talk about planning in the public interest. But why don't the public pay more attention to it? Why aren't they interested more in planning? And I've asked other people about whether or not they feel that, is it a conversation down the pub? Do people actually talk about planning on a day-to-day basis? How do we connect with people better?
Yeah, it's difficult. I mean, the truth is, people do talk about planning down the pub all the time, but what they don't use that term. So if you think about the biggest local political issues for a local community are always planning, aren't they? Those are the ones that generate all the heat. They certainly do in my hometown, where there's an enormous kind of divisive, angry debate about the future going on, but the planning system's not connecting with that in a way that enables people to be a part of it. And that's partly because planning has drifted into a very formalized space. It needs to be formal, of course, for some parts of what it does. But the wider skills, I mean, when I stumbled into planning, I stumbled off the street into an urban studies centre, if you remember that.
Yeah.
and I loved, and had no formal training, and was just, had my head taken off by just what it was to think about space and maps, and more importantly, how you could affect change. So what we have is actually, we do have hundreds of thousands of planners out there, mostly in local community groups. Think about all the people involved in planning for flood risk and all the flood action groups and all these different networks that we interact with. But they don't see themselves, they see planning as a problem. They see planning as the enemy. They see planning as done to them.
Yeah.
And that's what we've got to change. Now, we did that in the 1970s with Colin Ward and lots of other people. We genuinely had a process of the resources to work with communities, not to impose, but to help partly inspire them, give them choices, and partly enable what they wanted. But Steve, I mean, that feels like a very long time ago. Who's had resources to do that for decades, really, I guess. So local government is in a small, tight box, isn't it, with so much pressure on it. It does not have the capacity to have the conversation. And that's what we need. You need a conversation about your street, your home, and the nation needs a conversation desperately about its future, and what goes where, very crudely, and how you deal with climate change. But that conversation is not happening.
Well, it's certainly true that there's been a rise in expectation of what planning will deal with, and a reduction in resources, and you could argue skills and knowledge to actually deal with it. And I think that's a challenge. I want to ask you about the white paper. I know it's been a while now. Consultation has been closed for nearly 6 months, I think, and as we speak. But it's still in the ether. It's still things that the government are thinking about. We've seen changes in the current planning regime, changes in the NPPF. Where are you on this? Do you see this as a great opportunity, or are you more worried?
Well, the first thing to say, because I can say it to you, is that where I am on this is nowhere, in one sense, because I as I've said in other spaces, I've had no influence at all over either of these two processes. And we have to be a bit more honest, neither is the TCPA, actually, in a way. We've done our very best to advocate an entire evidence-based new system in the Rainsford review, and it got thoroughly ignored. So I am very worried about it, because this isn't evidence-led, which would be a starting point for reform. This is largely about ideology, and it's also not going to work, because planning is not about the shape of a development plan, Steve, is it? It's about the complex interaction of land, money, power, people, design, all mixed together. And it takes, you have to be pretty good at changing it. And the white paper, frankly, without any shadow of a doubt, was the worst basis for reform in 30 years of planning reform I've ever seen. And now, of course, the difficulty is people have got to try and make it work, and I'm sure they will. And at the same time, so you've got these two wild horses. One wild horse is the existing planning system, which is being driven hard towards a cliff, and it's underfed and under-resourced, and the changes to the MPPF are happening. And Class E PDR, which maybe we'll talk about, but as far as I'm concerned, is the end of the local plan for urban areas. That's going on the one hand, and then the white paper will sweep that away and produce something else in the autumn. I don't know. I think it's I try and be positive, but I'm actually slightly proud that we had no influence on this reform. It won't work. It's in the wrong direction. It's not fit for purpose. It won't solve climate change. It does reduce democracy. It makes pretty much every fundamental mistake you can make in thinking about a new planning system. Well, from a practical point of view, and I think from a democratic point.
Well, before you tell me you're going to resubmit the Rainsford report as your response to the consultation belatedly, but let me just come back to on a couple of things you mentioned there. The democratic role. I mean, the government have made much of the fact that the public will be involved in front-loaded, and where have we heard that word before? I think in every reform, 2004 Act, I think was I saw loads of presentations with front-loaded washing machines on. Everything was going to be front-loaded. But if you embrace the white paper and say, well, it'll be front-loaded, people will be having a big say in the formulation of the plans. I've asked people before when I've spoken to audiences, who's put a planning application in, and there's a spattering of hands, and who's objected, and there's usually more hands that go up to say, yes, we've objected. But if ever I ask who's been involved with a local plan, it's very few people that actually admit to the fact they've been involved in plan making. But the anticipation is that there will be this rise in plan making, perhaps building on the neighbourhood planning experience, that people will get engaged in front, and that's where your democratic accountability will come. Do you not buy that?
No, not at all. I mean, I'm also partly conscious that if you look at the changes to the existing system, they're reducing consultation periods from 3 weeks to 2 weeks, which makes a parish and town council's job virtually impossible. But on a more fundamental, so in other words, I am challenging the commitment to democracy in the system, because actually this is primarily about reducing the system to land licensing, so that so it can be somehow got out of the way, and that won't work. But I think in relation to zonal planning and coding, these systems can be made to work, Steve. So there's no opposition in principle to a new system. But in the white paper, it says very clearly that things like the right to be heard in person will disappear or become discretionary. Now, if the government recommits to that in the preparation of these new code plans that we will see, then that would make a huge difference to my position. But at the moment, what happens in the white paper is that we set these permissions through codes, through a classic zonal system up front in a once-only way. It's not clear communities have formal rights to be involved in that, just best-in-class consultation, which, is just nonsense. What the hell does that mean? And then, of course, you lose the second bite with the planning application. And that means that communities, once having had some kind of bite of the cherry, are locked out of decision-making for how long? A decade, perhaps more? And developers get on with it, despite the fact the world is changing and climate means we'll need to do other things. But I don't see anything in the white paper that guarantees that kind of democratic input, because, again, we know this. Handling people and planning is really hard. But if you try to squeeze them out of the system, they will simply protest. And despite the changes to protest laws happening at the moment, you'll never stop that, because people are so connected with their local areas. At the moment, what happens is you can say to people, Steve, as you often did, look, you may not like this, but you've got a right to be heard. You can be heard in front of an inspector. You can have your day. And you know what? That's quite powerful. And once you've heard your day, if you lose the argument, well, look, you need to accept that. That's just the way things are. Can't say that to people anymore unless you have a formal.
No, you're right, and it was one of the defences for environmental justice. Airhouse, and it was a way in which people had the right through the planning system to be heard. But I think that there is an argument, and I'm just devil's advocating it to in part, to say that, well, if people have influenced the plan and had master planned how a piece of land might be used, then if a developer comes along and does that and proceeds to implement what's in the plan, then there's a real need for further engagement. People, have had their say, and it's going to be built as was planned. Do you think that the problem is that won't happen, and that the market and the way in which land is seen has a value, and not all permissions are implemented? We know this. Something between 20 and 40% of permissions fall out for various reasons in a year, quite often because they're being reapplied for, they're sold on, and people come back with different schemes. Is it because that in reality people don't behave as the plan predicts?
Well, I mean, the evidence from international examples is that, where zonal systems based on a codified system exist, the codes in order to create good places have to be incredibly complicated. And that's what you get. You get very detailed codes. So what if the government wants to try and find it? It wants to pull a rabbit out of a hat, and the rabbit's just not there. So on the one hand, if decisions are made upfront in a code and through a zonal system, those codes are going to be Dutch-style codes. I expect to see everything in them. We'll expect to see resilience standards, SUDs, the whole framework of panoply of design code considerations. And that's a very inflexible list of issues, but great if that's there, if people have had a right to be heard, if the plans are fully accountable, if local government's got some proper power. But even with all of that, there are two flicks of the tail of the white paper that tell you that it's a lie. One, that permitted development, of course, applies throughout all three zones. And secondly, that you can apply for planning application outside of what the plan says. And it explicitly says that. Well, why can you? You shouldn't be able to in the system. In many European systems, it's simply in line with the code or it's not. And if it's not, well, go and go. So essentially what they're trying to do is have their cake and eat it, isn't it? They're trying to move to a zonal system, a streamlined zonal system, but also give developers the opportunity to apply outside that regime. And they should have made their mind up what they want. I would say one thing. I'm not going to defend 1947 because people have told me I'm ridiculous in defending 47. So two things about it are interesting. One, it wasn't a socialist conspiracy. It was the most elegant and sophisticated output of a serious amount of heavyweight policy research that led to the nailing of 4 or 5 fundamental issues that any planning system needs to produce. But interestingly, the fact that it was discretionary was designed to make it more sophisticated and more flexible. And although that's worked for developers sometimes and not communities, I entirely accept that. It's interesting now, isn't it, that what we need is a system to deal with the rapid change that society is now undergoing, particularly climate, not just that, post-pandemic economic change. If you set a code in year 1 and don't revise it for 10 years, and in Philadelphia, their zonal plan lasted a lot longer than that, didn't it, just with incremental change, then you've built yourself the classic inflexible planning system. I'm going to ask you this question. For all those involved in the white paper, is that really, if you're in the private sector or in communities or in local government, is that really what you want? Because that's what you're about to get. And that is, it didn't come out in the white paper process because it all became very crude and sloganizing. But hey, they will have to struggle to make that work.
Well, time will see how the government responds to the consultation process, which had over 40,000 responses. It's interesting that one of the things the white paper talks about is sort of putting a clear requirement for sustainable development to be the objective of plan making. How do you think we're faring on achieving sustainable development? I mean, do you think that the white paper will improve things, or do you think we're still falling short and will continue to fall short on matters such as addressing the climate change challenge?
Yeah.
You mentioned flooding earlier. These are real issues.
I think this is really difficult because, again, we're here to talk honestly, aren't we? And when people are critical of the existing planning system, you can't pretend that they don't have a point. I think we might point out that a lot of the problems with the existing planning system are about those who've shoved deregulation, But I think that the delivery of sustainable development at the moment is still an enormous issue for us that we're just not getting right. I'll give you an example of that. When we cancelled zero carbon homes in 2016 as a result largely of pressure from the house building industry, that was a disaster for carbon and for the industry itself because of the business model of modernising. And the supply chains that would have produced would have been extremely useful. But more than 1 million homes could have been built by now, couldn't they, to that standard, given what we've delivered. So we're not tackling sustainable development head on. I think the current system in principle is really capable of doing that. And you're seeing the United Nations goals put into the MPPF, which is positive. But then you're seeing a sentence that says, at a very high level, these are what you should be delivering. Well, actually, no, not at a very high level. Those issues in there should be delivered actually throughout the framework in a really detailed way. But, I don't know. The biggest problem we've got, I guess, with sustainable development is permitted development, because there you have a shadow planning system, and the outcomes of that, Steve, are heartbreaking. And I have to say, for me personally, having been and looked at them, to see industrial estates and kids in car parks and windows. I mean, I think that, if I'm honest with you, I think that led to as close to a professional nervous breakdown as I've ever had as a planner, because that's not what we do. And to be a part of it was really damaging. And in that context, sustainable development's got nothing to do with that stuff, has it? That's about someone with a quick idea wanting to roll that stuff out without any regard of the consequences for the environment or people. And now you look at the consequences of that, it's producing stuff that you and I both know will take decades to fix.
Yeah, I think I've seen the photograph of the I think it's two flats, isn't it, in a car park, and it's a stark illustration of what can happen. But is the answer going to be the national design codes and the design guidance? The ambition is for the outcomes, the great places to be codified, every street to be tree lined. Is this going to help solve your angst?
No, I mean, it's great. Trees are lovely, but it's more. It's one element of good design, isn't it? I mean, it's not the only element of good design. And it's interesting, isn't it, that if you're going to put, I mean, a lot of people are very critical of putting beauty into the MPPF, and again, you know what, it's quite hard to see how a concept like that can be defined, and so it is quite problematic. But hey, it's there. But the thing about good design is that it's not just about aesthetics. It is about carbon, and it is about flood resilience. And interestingly, it's also about equality, because if you want good design to create safe spaces for people, that needs to be a priority as well. I think the design coding, given that the quality of a lot of the housing that's been produced is pretty poor, I'm sure it helps. Does it solve the problem? Well, no, not unless you know what status it's going to have in decision making, and it's the delivery of it that seems to me to be really unclear, Steve. That's how is it? What status is it going to have at the local level? I mean, in terms of who's going to adopt it. I mean, I think it's a step forward though in terms of the recognition of design, but doesn't apply to PDR, does it? Unless design is mentioned.
Well, they can look at putting the conditions around the PDR to try and pick up the standards, and they certainly improve the office to residential through doing a review of the actual conditions, windows, and standards. But CCPA produced a sort of healthy planning act. Sort of, what's the alternative approach that you're sort of putting forward in that idea?
It's a simple one really, because you can't take permitted development head on, because it stands on the tail of those who see planning as a problem and want to get rid of it. So it's it's close to the heart of government and their conception of planning. So what you do is you simply do kind of what you just said, really. You say, okay, well, let's invent a set of standards that create healthy places for people. But, the heart of it, and that's what the draft bill does. But the interesting thing, Steve, is the people who've picked it up, which are largely the healthcare profession. And that's been really interesting, because that, as you say earlier on, it gets back to our roots. We came out of public health, or a lot of what we do came out of public health, and we're returning there. And I think that the Marmot Review and all of that evidence that's being produced is really driving the purpose of planning around the health agenda. I'd even go so far as to say, maybe, just to make you smile, maybe we should return planning to the Department of Health where it was post-war. And see if MHCLG should give it up. Because in some senses, as you say, planning is so all-encompassing. You need to locate it with a sort of priority. And I can't help but feel that a planning system that started from the idea of securing people's health and well-being in the context of sustainable development wouldn't be, as they say, a really good idea. And that's where I think we've ended with that. I mean, you and I both know, are we going to get a bill through? No, but people like Lord Nigel Crisp, who used to run the NHS, is an enthusiast for it, and I hope it has some traction. But I do think it would have made a huge difference to permitted development if those standards had been there, because you would have had some safeguards.
Well, as you would expect as a former chief planner, I would always argue that there should be a Department of Planning to which the health part of health should be linked. But that aside, I don't think that's ever going to happen. I want to try to wrap up with sort of a discussion about where you think it's going. I mean, I suppose I'm thinking there'll be some people here who are at the sort of earlier in their career who might be looking at this discussion and saying, well, certainly in my case, a grumpy old man talking about how life used to be much better in early days, and yet I was enthusiastic about planning when I began my career, and in fact, I'm enthusiastic about it now. So, how do I give people reassurance who are looking at us talking and thinking about we're not all going to hell in a handcart, that actually planning is a good thing to do, and that there is a future for planning? Do you not feel there is?
The funny thing about me, and also, I'm also a signed up member of the Grumpy Old Sod Club, Steve, and the greatest pleasure in life is to talk to, younger people and young planners and also in communities about possibilities. That's the thing that sustains us, isn't it? I actually think that this is a particularly difficult time for this very narrow debate about the legal framework for planning. But the idea of planning that we talked about at the beginning, I actually think we're about to embark on the decade where the principles and the learning and the importance of planning is going to come thundering back to us in stark relief. Why? Because planning wasn't a sort of idea to make you and I and others happy, was it? It was driven by real issues about the organisation of society. And the work we're doing with the insurance industry on climate change is so terrifying about the future of coastal communities just on that issue. And then the work that we're doing, how can you create a landscape of equality in our towns and cities for everybody? How can you solve the health crisis, the obesity crisis through thinking about walkable places? Everywhere you think the great crisis of society, the great challenges we face, planning is at the heart of all of them. It's not the only thing, plainly, it has to be done, but it's at the heart of all of them. So all those people entering their careers, you just have to hold on, I think, to that inspiration. Partly you come from a great tradition of people thinking about ideal places, and I'm going to use the utopia word because I have to get it in once. That's what we are. Utopia is not an undeliverable place; it's just an ideal place, and ideals are a good thing. So I feel very positive about that. It is true that, well, as you know, in the podcast I recorded, I think it's also good to be honest about our, certainly my failures to make a difference to planning reform, and I feel those acutely. But you know what, Steve, you're right. There is an enormous future, an enormous challenge, and in some sense, I'm not saying it's going to be easy. I don't think it's going to be easy, but I think it's going to be exciting. It's going to be an amazing time to be alive, because these issues either have to be solved, or we're going to start losing cities, coastal cities, within the next half century.
Yeah.
May not be alive by that point, but the people who are now young practitioners are at the heart of saving those places, for example. So yeah, in that sense, it may not be easy, but it's going to be interesting. It's going to be Hollywood, I think, Steve.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned your podcast, Hugh, because for anybody who's listening, I thoroughly recommend them. It brought out the inner Alan Bennett in you, I think, which was very. But there were five. I think there's five very good pieces on planning. But I suppose the question which that leads me to is about new technology, digitization, the way in which the society works now, and the opportunities there are for people to much more quickly engage in issues. It's no longer the case that I need to book a village hall to talk about planning to the 20 people who bothered to turn up. You've seen in campaigns, whether it be about safe places or whether it be about equality and diversity, you can very quickly gather a momentum behind a cause or a standard. So how does planning get its sort of standard rallied round and earn back the respect that it used to have? And I don't think the values have been undermined, but there is a bit of me that thinks there's a huge opportunity for planning and planners to embrace the new technology to sort of carry the standard forward. Is that something that you recognise, or do you think it's more challenge than that?
Well, I think it is an opportunity. I mean, I'm as ever, because it's me. I'm slightly sceptical in one sense. There's no doubt new technology offers us all this new ways of talking to each other. Some of that can be positive, Stephen, in planning, as you know, from some sort of social media campaign. Sometimes it can go pretty badly wrong, can't it, and end in pretty difficult places. And of course, there's issues of digital exclusion, and all those are really important. For me, I think that it is a massive new medium. The question is how you apply it. And that's why, the government's sort of obsession with digital is solving all problems. But of course it won't, because it doesn't solve fundamental issues about who's got power and who hasn't. But it does potentially give these wider audiences, I think. But in a way, I would go back to the starting point. If somebody said to me, where are we with planning? I'd say we're sort of at that point where somebody needs to write Ebenezer's book again. And by the way, it's not going to be me because I'm too stupid. But it is at that point where someone actually takes all of these issues and these challenges and distills them into a moment where society reconnects with the huge benefit of organising ourselves properly and how that works. And that's in the TCPA, people talk about the Marcus Rashford moment. Who's going to have a campaign for planning? But I think at the heart of that is how we make that relevant. We are relevant to people's lives, but we've just got to find a way of doing that. I think that means we've got to get out of our box. We probably need to link up with some of those people who are doing a lot of the kind of cutting edge campaign. That they should be a part of it. That's part of us too, isn't it? We are professionals, we are technical, but we are also artists. So it says that's the brief we have: the art and science. Yeah. And we're also campaigners. I don't want us, and would never want planning to be narrowly ideological. It's always been a broad church, but I do want it to start getting behind some key values. And I think those values are things like climate change, things like equality and the needs of, as I've said, of women and girls, and of race equality and of access. Those things we can help with and positively help with. So I think it's that relevance question. I also think, I don't know, maybe we should start an aging rock band. And the most successful thing we ever did, Steve, at the TCPA was communicate planning through the medium of Bruce Springsteen. I still think that's the way forward. But I'm not. One thing I feel very positive about. I don't. We have made mistakes, but I don't want to apologise for planning. It's just bloody brilliant. It's just the most important thing for the future. It's the defining characteristic of a civilized society. Is whether you care, Steve, isn't it, about your neighbour, how your community develops, whether people get fair access to the basics of life. It's all about that care. And that
is a brilliant place to end. And I'll just say that as a webinar that's mentioned Kylie, Alan Bennett, Marcus Rashford, and Bruce Springsteen, that is a first for me. Thank you for spending time and talking to me. It's been a pleasure.
Pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Steve.